He handed me the lawsuit like a receipt. No hesitation, no explanation, just a white envelope with my name printed in cold black letters. Plaintiff, Grace Whitmore. Defendant, her father. For a moment I thought it was a mistake, a sick joke, some bureaucratic error. Then I saw her signature, the same looping G she used to draw on birthday cards when she was 7. My daughter was suing me, not for money, not for property, for interfering in her life. At 73, after a lifetime of teaching, loving, and showing up, I stood on my porch in my slippers and robe, holding the proof that my love had become a bad thing. And in that quiet Oregon morning, with the smell of rain and burnt coffee in the air, I realized something that chilled me to the bone. Sometimes the people you die for will try to erase you while you're still alive. Before we go on, tell us, where are you watching from? Follow our channel so you won't miss the next story. Tales of love, justice, and second chances. You've been served, he said, tucking his clipboard under his arm and walking back toward his grey Toyota parked by the curb. I stood on the porch of my little house in Bend, Oregon, wearing my old flannel robe and wool socks, the air still smelling of pine and cold. The sun hadn't climbed over the ridge yet. I could see my breath. For a few seconds, I just stared at the envelope. It was white and stiff, my full name, Charles R. Halbrook, printed in heavy official letters. The return address read, Multnomah County Superior Court. At first, I thought maybe it was some legal mix-up about property taxes or a mistake with my pension. Then I saw the name under Plaintiff. Grace Halbrook Whitmore, my daughter, my only child. The mug of coffee trembled in my hand. I set it down on the railing before it spilled. I broke the seal, unfolded the pages, and started reading. Claim, disturbance of privacy, emotional interference, and continued unsolicited involvement in private household affairs. My throat went dry. There were other words, cold, formal ones, repeated presence, unannounced visits, psychological strain. It didn't feel real. I read the next line twice, slowly, because my eyes refused to accept it. We request a legal restriction order and reimbursement for unauthorized financial involvement. She wanted me gone, and she wanted money. Grace, the girl whose bicycle I built from spare parts the summer she turned 9. The girl who used to call me every night from college because she couldn't sleep without hearing Dad's voice. The girl I taught to change a flat tire, to whistle with her fingers, to never apologize for being kind. That girl had filed a lawsuit against me. I sat down on the porch step, my knees aching, the wood cold against my palms. The world was still turning. I could hear the sound of a neighbor's sprinklers, the soft hiss of tires on the distant highway, but something in me had stopped completely. 73 years old. 40 of them teaching physics at Jefferson High, 9 as a widower, all of them as a father, and now a defendant. It hadn't started this way. It started the year she and Adam moved to Portland after their second baby, June, was born. They'd been drowning, long work hours, sleepless nights, a mortgage that was too big for comfort. I'd just sold the old place in Salem after Marjorie passed, and I wanted to be useful. So I bought a small house 2 hours away, close enough to visit, far enough not to crowd. That's what I told myself anyway. I'll be nearby if you need help, I said when I showed her the listing photos. Grace smiled politely. That's nice, Dad. I didn't notice the pause between words then. I thought I was doing something beautiful. In the first few months, I dropped by often. I'd mow their lawn when Adam was out of town, bring over chicken soup or lasagna when Grace sounded tired on the phone, take the kids to the park on weekends so they could nap. She used to thank me back then. She'd say, "You're a lifesaver, Dad." But slowly, things shifted. I couldn't tell when it happened. Maybe the day she started calling me Charles instead of Dad on the phone. Or maybe it was the afternoon she mentioned a word that would soon rewrite our whole relationship. Boundaries. At first, she said it softly, like an experiment. "Dad, we just need a little more space, okay?" then firmer. Dad, I love you, but you can't just show up. And finally cold. You need to respect our boundaries. She said it like a line she'd rehearsed. And I, fool that I was, nodded, smiled, said, "Of course, sweetheart." Then went home and cried into a paper napkin at the kitchen table, trying to figure out when caring turned into crime. The first real blow came 6 months later. It was a Wednesday. June had been sick the weekend before, and I'd cooked a pot of chicken stew, her favourite since she was 2. I drove it across town, humming along to the old Johnny Cash cassette that still lived in my truck. When Grace opened the door, she didn't even take her hands off her phone. "Dad, you can't just drop by like this." "I brought dinner. You sounded worn out, so I thought—" "Dad," her voice cut sharp this time, "we've talked about this. You have to call first." I hesitated, holding the warm pot between my hands. "I'm sorry, I just—" "Boundaries, Dad," she said, lowering her phone now. "Please." Behind her, I could see little June at the kitchen table coloring. She looked up and waved, her crayon-stained hand fluttering like a small flag. I waved back. Then Grace closed the door. Not hard, not cruel, just final. I set the pot on the porch and walked back to the truck, my breath fogging in the cold air. When I looked in the rear-view mirror, I saw Grace open the door again. She bent down, picked up the pot, and set it inside the house. That small mercy was the only reason I didn't break down right there in the driveway. Now, sitting in my own kitchen with a lawsuit spread across the table, I understood. All those little moments, the distance, the polite smiles, the requests to text first, they had been warnings, and I'd missed every one of them. The thing about love is, you don't notice when it starts to shrink. It doesn't slam the door. It just fades. Until one morning it arrives in a white envelope with your name printed in bold. The papers sat on the kitchen table all night. Every time I walked past, I caught sight of that thick black font spelling out my name, Defendant Charles Halbrook, and felt my chest tighten. I didn't call anyone. Not my sister in Arizona, not my old colleague from Jefferson High, not even my neighbor Bill, who always offered bourbon when words failed. Instead, I poured another cup of stale coffee, sat down and started opening drawers. The folder I was looking for was in the bottom of the cabinet under the microwave, the one Marjorie used to call my organized mess. Inside were 15 years of records, bank statements, checks, wire transfers, receipts folded in half and dated neatly in pen. I started stacking them one after another, the down payment I'd helped with on their first house in Portland, the new water heater when theirs broke that icy February, summer camp for June 3 years in a row, the dental bill for little Leo when he chipped his tooth on the playground. I'd never called any of it help. I'd called it love. But love, apparently, didn't translate well into legal language. I took a notepad and started writing, not for court, not to prove anything, just to remember. March 2015. Helped with closing costs, $20,000. August 2017. Paid for Grace's car repair, $2,400. December 2019. New laptop when she started that online MBA. July 2021. Babysat for 10 days straight while Adam was traveling. Every single year, Christmas, birthdays, doctor's bills, small kindnesses no one keeps receipts for. By the time I looked up, it was nearly midnight. The papers covered the entire table like a map of my life, every dollar a heartbeat. And suddenly I realized she wasn't suing me for money. Not really. She was suing me for presence, for being the man who showed up even when uninvited, for being too much of something she didn't know how to handle anymore. The next morning, the rain came heavy. Oregon rain, thick, steady, indifferent. I made toast, burned it, threw it out, and made another. I thought of Grace as a baby, how she used to crawl into our bed at dawn, hair sticking up like a wild sunflower, whispering, "Daddy, I had a dream." I thought of her as a teenager, slamming the car door, yelling, "You don't understand anything!" and me standing in the driveway saying, maybe not now, but one day I hope I will. Maybe that day had come, and maybe understanding hurt more than ignorance ever did. Around noon, I decided to call someone, not family. I couldn't bear to hear the sympathy. I called Evelyn, my old colleague from the school. We'd taught side by side for 20 years, me physics, her literature. She was 75 now, retired, living with her 2 cats and too many opinions for one person. When I told her what had happened, she went quiet for a long time. Then, with that dry calm she always had, she said, "So your daughter is suing you? Because you care too loudly?" I laughed, though it came out like a cough. "Apparently." "Then let her lawyer explain what silence feels like," Evelyn said. "But you keep your dignity. That's the only thing they can't take." I nodded, even though she couldn't see it. That evening I went walking. The streets were empty, except for puddles reflecting the amber streetlights. I passed the little park where I used to take June and Leo to feed ducks. The swings were still creaking in the wind. I sat on a bench, pulled my coat tighter, and whispered to no one. I never wanted to be their problem. But that's the thing about aging. Love doesn't shrink just because the world around you does. It stays the same size even when it doesn't fit anymore. 2 days later, there was a knock on the door. For a second I thought it might be her. It wasn't. It was a courier, a young woman in a rain jacket holding another envelope. "Delivery for Mr. Holbrook," she said. When I opened it, my hands shook again. It wasn't from the court this time. It was handwritten, folded twice, tucked in between official documents like a secret. The handwriting stopped me cold. Small, uneven, familiar. June. "Grandpa, Mom and Dad are mad at you, but I don't really know why. I heard them say you make things complicated, but I like when you come over. You make pancakes the best. I miss you." No signature. Just a doodle of a little heart and a crooked pancake with a smiley face. I sat down on the couch, letter trembling in my hand. The rain outside blurred the windows until everything looked like watercolor. I hadn't cried in years, not since Marjorie's funeral, but that night I did, quietly, fully, and when I was done, I made myself a promise. One I whispered into the empty room like a vow. If they take everything, the visits, the dinners, the laughter, they won't take my kindness. I won't let them rewrite me as someone I never was. Because sometimes the only way to survive love gone cold is to keep loving anyway. 3 mornings after the letter from June arrived, I woke up to the sound of gravel crunching outside. Through the thin curtains, I saw a black SUV idling by the curb, my daughter's car. My heart lurched before my mind could decide what to feel. For a moment I just stood there in the hallway, barefoot, unsure whether to open the door or pretend I wasn't home. Then I heard it, the knock, 3 polite taps, the kind you give when you don't want the visit to last. When I opened the door, Grace was standing there in her trench coat, arms crossed, eyes red but dry. She didn't hug me. She didn't smile. "Can we talk?" she asked. I stepped aside, gesturing toward the living room. "Of course." She walked in like she was afraid to touch anything. Her eyes flicked to the half-finished crossword on the table, the coffee ring on the counter, the photo of Marjorie by the window, the one Grace hadn't mentioned in years. I waited. She took a breath and said, "Dad, I didn't want it to get this far." I nodded slowly, but it did. Her lips pressed together. "You have to understand, this isn't personal." That word again. Personal. The word people use when they're about to say something that cuts. I sat down, motioning for her to do the same. "Grace, it's me, your father. Everything about this is personal." She hesitated, then sat across from me. Her hands trembled slightly, the wedding ring catching the light. "You show up without asking," she said. "You bring food when we've already told you not to. You reorganized our pantry, Dad." I was trying to help. "I know," she said quickly, almost pleadingly. "I know that's what you think you're doing, but it feels like you're ignoring us, like our choices don't matter." I looked at her, really looked. The same sharp jawline as her mother, the same stubborn eyes. "And suing me?" I asked quietly. "That's how you make your choices matter?" Her shoulders stiffened. "We didn't think you'd actually fight it." "So you thought I'd what? Disappear?" She didn't answer. The silence between us stretched until it filled the room. The clock on the wall ticked louder than it should have. Finally I said, "You could have just told me to stay away. You didn't need a lawyer." Her eyes flickered. "Adam thought—" "Adam," I interrupted, my voice rougher than I intended. "Does Adam make all the calls now?" "Dad?" "No, I'm serious. Did he write the words emotional interference, or was that yours?" She blinked hard, jaw tightening, and for a second, just a second, I saw something crack, the mask of control, the calm tone, all of it. Tears welled in her eyes before she blinked them away. "I just needed space," she whispered. "Every time you come by, every time you comment on something, it makes me feel like I'm 16 again, like nothing I do is right." Her voice trembled on the last word, and that's when I understood. This wasn't about casseroles or unannounced visits. This was about history. Old wounds disguised as new boundaries. I leaned forward, softer now. "Grace, I never wanted to make you feel small. I only ever wanted to remind you that you were loved, that someone was always in your corner." She wiped her cheek. "Sometimes that feels like pressure." I nodded. "Maybe it does, but love and control aren't the same thing. I never tried to run your life. I just didn't know how to stop being a dad." She looked away then, toward the photo of her mother. The sunlight hit it just right, the glass flashing like a small flame. When she spoke again, her voice was smaller. "Mom would have known how to handle this." I swallowed hard. Probably. She was better with words. We both laughed, quietly, the kind of laugh people use to stop from crying. Grace stood, smoothing the front of her coat. "Dad, I can't undo the case, not yet. But maybe we can talk before it goes further." "That's all I've ever wanted," I said. She hesitated at the door, hand on the knob. "Just don't come by for a while, okay? Let me figure things out." I nodded. "I can do that." When she left, the house felt smaller than before, like her absence was something physical that squeezed the air out of the rooms. I sat back down at the table, the lawsuit still open beside June's letter, one written in legal language, the other in crayon. And I thought, not for the first time, maybe children forget that we were people before we were parents. That night, I didn't eat. I just walked the perimeter of the house, turning lights off one by one until the only thing glowing was the photo of Marjorie by the window. "I did my best," I whispered to her. Her smile in that picture, taken the summer before she passed, didn't change. But somehow I felt like she understood. The next day, I drove to the courthouse, not to fight, to listen. The lawyer's office was colder than the weather outside. A young man named Mr. Dalton met me in the lobby, shaking my hand like he was trying to squeeze something out of me. "I've reviewed the claim," he said. "It's, unusual." "I'd call it heartbreaking," I replied. He smiled tightly. "That too." We sat, went through the details, the statements, the accusations. He asked if I had evidence of financial support. I handed him the folder. He flipped through it in silence, pages rustling like leaves. When he was done, he looked up. "Mr. Halbrook, what do you want out of this?" I thought for a long moment before answering. "I want her to remember who I am, not who she's decided I am." He nodded. "Then we'll make sure the court hears that." As I left his office, I passed a bakery. The smell of cinnamon rolls hit me like a memory. Saturday mornings, Grace sitting at the kitchen counter with flour on her nose, helping me roll dough. I bought two, one for me, one for nobody. When I got home, I put the extra on a plate by the window beside Marjorie's photo. Old habits die harder than hope. The day of the hearing came draped in grey. That kind of Oregon morning where the sky looks like damp linen and everything you touch feels colder than it should. I wore my navy suit, the one Marjorie always said made me look like I still believed in happy endings. It hung a little looser these days, but it would do. When I parked outside the courthouse, the air smelled faintly of wet cedar and diesel fumes. People hurried up the steps with umbrellas half open, eyes down. No one looked at anyone. That was how it felt inside, too, like we'd all agreed not to exist too loudly. Grace was already there. She stood by the far wall, hands clasped, her hair pulled back in the neat bun she wore to client meetings. Adam sat beside her, thumb scrolling across his phone, pretending to be anywhere else. She looked up as I entered. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second, enough for me to see that she'd been crying, not enough for her to admit it. The bailiff called the room to order. When the judge came in, a tall woman with tired eyes and a patient voice, we all stood, then sat. Grace's lawyer, a sharp young man in an expensive suit, went first. He spoke softly, politely, like the words themselves were fragile. He called me a loving but over-involved father who struggles with boundaries. He said I created emotional strain in my daughter's home, that my presence compromised the family's sense of autonomy. He never said dad. He never said love. When he finished, the judge nodded toward my attorney. "Mr. Dalton," she said, "your turn." Dalton rose, calm, composed, and unfolded his notes. He didn't start with legal terms or statutes. He started with my story. "Your Honor," he said, "Mr. Halbrook is a retired teacher. For 4 decades, he taught physics to high school students in this very state. He raised his daughter alone after his wife passed, and by all accounts, he did so with devotion. The actions described in this case, dropping off food, assisting with childcare, covering bills, are not acts of harassment. They are acts of care. Misguided, perhaps, but not malicious." He paused. The words hung in the air like dust motes in winter light. "Love can be clumsy," he said quietly, "but it is not a crime." Then he turned to me. "Mr. Halbrook, would you like to speak?" My throat felt like sandpaper, but I stood anyway. "Your Honor," I began, "I'm not here to argue that my daughter's feelings are wrong. Maybe I did overstep. Maybe I showed up when I shouldn't have. But everything I did came from love, not control. I never wanted to make her feel small. I just didn't know how to stop being a father." I turned my head toward Grace. She didn't meet my eyes at first, but then, slowly, she did. "When she was a little girl," I continued, "she used to crawl into bed between me and her mother after thunderstorms. She'd press her face into my shoulder and say, 'Don't let go, Daddy.' And I never did. Not once. Now she's asking me to let go. I understand that. But not like this. Not with lawyers and papers. I just want her to know I hear her. And that even if she wins, she hasn't lost me." The judge watched me carefully. Her eyes softened just slightly. When I sat down, the courtroom went very still. Even the ceiling fans seemed to stop. Then the judge spoke. Her tone was even, deliberate, but there was something human in it, a trace of empathy she couldn't quite hide. "Family cases," she said, "are the hardest ones, because they ask the law to define love, and the law was never built for that." She glanced at Grace. "At its heart, this isn't a case about harassment or interference. It's about hurt. And hurt doesn't dissolve with restraining orders." Her gaze shifted between us. "I am denying the request for a no-contact order. I am also denying the financial reimbursement claim. This court urges both parties to find resolution through conversation, not litigation." The gavel came down, one sharp sound, clean as a breath after sobbing. Grace didn't move at first. Neither did I. People filed out around us, lawyers, clerks, strangers, and we just sat there in silence. When she finally stood, she didn't look angry, just exhausted. She turned toward me, hesitated, then whispered, "I didn't think you'd speak like that." "I didn't either," I said softly. She nodded once, then left the room with Adam trailing behind her. I stayed seated until the room was empty. Then I exhaled, not relief, not victory, just air that had been trapped in my chest for weeks. Outside, the rain had stopped. The pavement glistened, and somewhere a busker was playing a soft tune on a saxophone. I walked slowly down the courthouse steps, feeling the weight of something invisible lifting off my shoulders. When I reached my car, I saw a small figure standing by the passenger side, June. Her yellow raincoat made her look like a drop of sunlight. "Mom said we couldn't come," she said, "but I came anyway." I bent down, blinking fast. "You did?" She nodded. "I wanted to give you this." She handed me a folded piece of notebook paper. Inside was a drawing, a big tree with two stick figures under it, one labelled me, the other Grandpa. Above them, written in shaky letters, "We still belong." I couldn't speak. She smiled, shy and brave, all at once. "Mum's crying in the car," she said softly, "but I think she heard you." I hugged her, carefully, briefly, and whispered, "Thank you, Junie Bean." She grinned. "You still call me that?" "Always will." Then she ran off toward the parking lot, her little boots splashing through puddles. That night, I sat in my kitchen with the court papers on one side and June's drawing on the other. One was law, the other was truth, and truth always wins, eventually. I didn't bake, didn't call anyone, didn't pour bourbon. I just sat there, with the sound of the refrigerator humming and the rain tapping lightly on the roof. Maybe this was what peace sounded like. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation. Just quiet, the kind that comes after you've said what needed to be said, and nothing is left but the ache of love still standing. 3 weeks passed after the hearing. 3 weeks of quiet mornings, slow rain, and the kind of silence that feels both heavy and merciful. No calls, no messages, no knock at the door. Grace hadn't reached out, and I hadn't expected her to. I knew her well enough to understand she needed time to untangle guilt from pride, anger from love. But some nights, when the house grew too still, I'd catch myself listening, for the faint echo of a child's laughter, for Marjorie's voice humming from another room, for the life I'd built that no longer lived here. Then I'd remember June's words, scrawled in crayon, "We still belong," and I'd breathe again. On the 21st morning, I went for a walk along the Deschutes River Trail. The air was sharp and clean, smelling of pine and damp earth. A thin mist hovered over the water, and the geese were loud that day, their cries cutting through the quiet like reminders that life, stubbornly, continues. I stopped by the small post office on the corner before heading home. The clerk, an old man named Howard, smiled and held up a thin brown envelope. "Something came for you, Charlie. No return address." My heart skipped. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable. Grace. I thanked him, took the envelope and walked home slowly, as if hurrying might scare it away. Inside, the house smelled faintly of cedar oil and last night's tea. I sat down by the window, sunlight slicing through the blinds, and opened the envelope carefully, like it might bleed. Inside were 3 pages. The first line stopped my breath. "Dad, I've started this letter 4 times. I don't know how to say what I need to say without sounding like the person I promised myself I wouldn't become." My eyes blurred before I'd reached the next line. I blinked hard and kept reading. "When you spoke in court, I hated that I felt relief. Relief that you didn't shout, that you didn't defend yourself like you used to when I was younger. I realized how much I'd built this story in my head, that you were controlling, overbearing, impossible to talk to. And maybe that version of you was easier to live with than the real one, because the real one still loved me, and I didn't know how to carry that without feeling guilty. She wrote about the past, about Marjorie, about the years after Mom died, about how she tried to become the strong one, the capable one. I didn't want to need you anymore, Dad. And when I did, it made me angry. I thought setting boundaries would make me free, but instead it made me lonely. I'm sorry for the lawsuit. I can't undo it, but I can own it. I can say it was cruel and cowardly and not what you deserved. I set the letter down for a moment. My hands were trembling. Then I read the last page. June talks about you all the time. She keeps your drawing on her desk. Leo asks when you'll make pancakes again. Adam's been quiet, but he regrets it too. I don't know what happens next. I don't know if we can go back. But I'd like to try, not as a daughter fixing her mistakes, but as a woman who finally understands the difference between space and absence. The last line was written in darker ink, as if she'd pressed harder. If you're willing, we'd like to come by Sunday. Sunday. I hadn't realized how long it had been since I'd cleaned for company. I vacuumed the living room, wiped the counters twice, polished the picture frames. I even baked banana bread, Marjorie's old recipe, the one Grace said smelled like home. At noon, the sound of tires on gravel made my chest tighten, the SUV parked by the curb. The back doors opened first, June jumping out, Leo following close behind. Then Grace stepped out. She looked older than I remembered, not tired but weathered, the way you look when you've been holding something heavy for too long. I opened the door before she could knock. For a heartbeat, we just stood there, the past and the present facing each other in a doorway that had seen both. "Hi, Dad," she said softly. "Hi, sweetheart." She smiled. It was small, hesitant, but real. Then she reached out, not for a handshake, not for distance, and hugged me. It wasn't long, it wasn't perfect, but it was enough. Inside, the house filled with sounds that had been missing. Children's laughter, footsteps, spoons clinking against mugs. Grace walked slowly around, touching things, the bookshelf, the window frame, the photo of her mother. "Still smells the same," she said. "Cedar and banana bread?" She laughed through her nose. "Yeah, and something else. Safety, maybe." We sat at the table. June chattered about school, Leo about his new bike. Grace listened, hands around her cup, eyes softer than I'd seen them in years. At one point she looked at me and said quietly, "Thank you for not giving up on me." I smiled. "I don't know how to do that." She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Then maybe I'll start learning from you." When they left that afternoon, the house didn't feel empty. It felt full, with something quiet, fragile, and alive again. I stood at the window as their car disappeared down the street. For the first time in months, I didn't feel erased. I felt written back in. That night, as the last light faded over the mountains, I opened Grace's letter one more time and reread that last line. "If you're willing, we'd like to come by Sunday." I smiled, folded it neatly, tucked it inside Marjorie's photo frame. Because some stories don't end with forgiveness. They end with continuing, and sometimes that's all love really asks, that we stay. The next Sunday, they came again. No letter, no warning, just the sound of tires crunching against gravel, the kind of sound that used to make my heart race with dread. This time, it didn't. I was in the garden, trimming the lavender that Marjorie planted the year Grace left for college. It had grown wild since then, spilling over the walkway, defying my neat lines. I left it that way on purpose. Some things, I decided, are meant to grow on their own terms. "Grandpa!" June's voice broke through the still morning like a melody I hadn't heard in years. She ran across the yard, curls bouncing, and wrapped her arms around my waist. Leo followed, quieter but smiling, holding a drawing folded in half. Grace walked behind them, holding a pie. "Thought you might like something sweet," she said. "Apple?" "Of course." We both laughed. Small, awkward, but honest. They came inside. I poured coffee, warmed milk for the kids, cut slices of banana bread from last night's loaf. The smell of cinnamon filled the kitchen again. For a while, we didn't talk about the past. We just existed. The four of us, in the same space, without tiptoeing around the old wounds. At one point, June asked, "Grandpa, are you still in trouble?" Grace's hand froze on her cup. I smiled gently. "No, sweetheart," I said. "Sometimes people just get confused about what love looks like. But we're figuring it out." Grace looked at me then, a long, quiet look that said everything words couldn't. Over the weeks, Sunday became a rhythm again. Sometimes they came, sometimes they didn't. But when they did, it wasn't out of obligation. It was because they wanted to. We'd cook together, Grace handling the stove, me hovering by the sink pretending not to supervise. Adam started coming too. He didn't say much at first, but one afternoon while we were grilling in the backyard, he handed me a beer and said, "I was wrong, Charlie." It wasn't an apology rehearsed for peace. It was simple, raw truth. I nodded. We all were. From that day on, he called me Dad again. One Sunday in late April, Grace came alone. The kids were at a sleepover, Adam at work. She sat on the porch with me, the wind carrying the smell of pine and wet soil from the hills. For a while, we said nothing, just watched the sky stretch wide and bright above the trees. Then she said softly, "I didn't know how much of Mom I still had in me until I heard you speak that day." She'd have said it better. Maybe, but she wouldn't have forgiven me as easily. I chuckled. No, she'd have sent a strongly worded letter. Grace smiled, looking down at her hands. "You know, when you stopped showing up, the house didn't feel peaceful. It felt empty. The kids noticed first, then me." I swallowed. "I only stopped because you asked me to. I know. And that's what broke me, because even when you had every reason to shout, you didn't. You gave me exactly what I said I wanted, and it made me realize what I'd thrown away." Her eyes glistened, and I reached out, resting a hand over hers. "We're here now, that's enough." She nodded. The wind picked up just then, scattering a few lavender petals across the porch. They landed on her lap, tiny purple stars against her jeans. She brushed one off and said quietly, "Mom would have loved that." "She's still here," I said. "Every time the lavender blooms, I feel her scolding me for cutting it too short." Grace laughed, the kind of laugh that starts in the chest and ends in tears. And just like that, something loosened between us, not erased, not fixed, but softened, like fabric worn smooth from being held too long. As spring turned to summer, our Sundays became small rituals. June and Leo helped me plant tomatoes in the yard. Grace read on the porch while I grilled. Adam fixed the broken gutter I'd been ignoring. No one mentioned the court anymore. It was as if the whole ordeal had folded itself into the silence between us, not forgotten but no longer heavy. One evening, as the sun sank low and the garden glowed gold, Grace handed me a small box. "What's this?" "Open it." Inside was a new photo frame, a picture of all of us, taken 2 weeks earlier, sitting on the back steps, June holding a bowl of strawberries, Leo mid-laugh, Grace leaning into my shoulder. On the bottom of the frame, engraved in small letters, it said, "Sundays, found again." My throat closed. She smiled softly. "I thought we'd start a new tradition." I looked at her, at my family, my imperfect, mended, living family, and I realized that maybe forgiveness isn't something you give or get. Maybe it's something you build piece by piece every time you show up again after everything fell apart. That night, after they left, I stood in the doorway watching the taillights disappear down the hill. The sky was wide and pale, stars beginning to breathe awake. I turned back inside, the air still warm from the oven and laughter. The photo sat on the mantel beside Marjorie's old picture. For the first time in a long time, the house didn't echo. It hummed. I sat by the window, pen in hand, and wrote a short note. Not for anyone to read, but for myself. Love doesn't end when it's misunderstood. It waits, quiet, patient, stubborn, until someone remembers how to listen again. Then I folded it and placed it inside the drawer where I keep Grace's first letter. Outside, the wind moved through the lavender, and I thought of Marjorie. Of all the years between the laughter and the silence, between losing and finding again. And for the first time since that white envelope arrived, I whispered into the dark. Not a prayer and not a question, just the truth I'd been carrying all along. I never stopped being her father. And that, I suppose, is how love survives. Not in perfection, not in apology, but in the quiet decision to stay and begin again. If you like this story, like the video, subscribe and tell me where you're listening from. And if you're a son or a daughter who's made a mess, call home. There's a porch light on in more places than you think.